and I'm delighted to have here the director of the King's Russia Institute, Dr. Sam Green, and then the investigative journalist, Andrei Soldatov, talking to us today from Moscow, Precious Chatterjee Dudi from the Open University, and Ruth Diamond from the Department of War Studies as well, Dr. Ruth Diamond. All of these people have a very long and distinguished pedigree in terms of their expertise. Sam Green was previously himself a journalist before taking up an academic career. And Andrei Soldatov is very well known for his work on the dark web. He has a book out called The Red Web, and has focused on espionage. So I think that his expertise will be highly relevant today. Precious Chatterjee Dudi has worked with the Reframing Russia project at the University of Manchester, looking at Russian disinformation, also the use of strategic narratives in propaganda and public diplomacy. Ruth Diamond has worked very extensively on Russian foreign policy, particularly its relations with the United States. So that will, I think, be highly relevant as well for our discussion today. So the running order is going to be first Sam Green, followed by Andrei, Precious, and Ruth. So I hope everybody's okay with that. Can I remind everybody that this event is being live streamed? So switch off now if you're not comfortable with that. And there will be a recording of the event that will be available to watch afterwards should you need to pop out to do anything more important than watching this. So without any more ado, I think we'll begin with Sam, and I'm going to ask each presenter to stick to about 10 minutes initially so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. And I'd like to remind the audience as well that you may post your questions in the Q&A. I think that will be easier than the raise your hand function on the whole, because we have quite a large number of people participating today. So I think that will help things to run more smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for putting this together, and to my co-panelists. It's a little bit difficult getting this conversation started, in that it is potentially a very big and wide-ranging conversation. But I think, and there have been a lot of conversations already, obviously, about this report, both in the academic space and sort of in the think tank world, and obviously in the media and in the public and political space. So I think that one of the things that we wanted to try to do today was to make things a little bit less about finger pointing and a little bit more about policymaking, and that's a little bit more forward looking. But obviously all of this is subject to to debate and questions. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A and to some back and forth with my co-panelists here. Now, what I want to say to get us started really is based on a view of Russian politics that I've developed over the last few years with my collaborator, Graham Roberts, in University of North Carolina. We published a book last year called Putin versus the People, which is really built around the idea that Putin's power is what we call co-constructed, right? Which means that it runs through and relies on the behaviors of others, right? Ranging from ordinary citizens who participate in elections or something that looks like elections, right, through to the country's political and economic elite, right? This is not to say that Russia is a democracy, right? Clearly it's not. But Putin's ability to be popular and to win elections, as well as his ability to be trusted by at least broad sections of the elite, right, makes his rule easier. It lessens the system's reliance on costly and risky coercion. It makes him more useful to elites, whose privilege and unaccountability his legitimacy protects, right? And his rule really is built around, at least in our view, right? So one implication of this, right, is that we need to broaden our view of Russian politics, right? We need to think of Russian politics as something that is bigger than just sort of the 4 inches or so between Vladimir Putin's ears. And we need to shift the emphasis a little bit further away from sort of structural explanations of Russian conflict with the West. It's one of the things that the report points to, and back at least a little bit towards a more agent-centric view of Russian politics, to understand the decisions that people are making, the interpretations that people have within the system, and why they have that. So really, there's 3 points that I want to make when it comes to Western policymaking in this context. The first of which is that Western policymakers really need to understand that Russian policy decisions seem to be situational. Right? So the paramount aim of any course of policy action pursued by the Kremlin, right, is the maintenance of power and the maximization of maneuverability in the service of that power. Right? The Kremlin does not like to be hemmed in domestically or internationally. So maneuverability matters. Right? Other policy priorities or decisions are inherently and inevitably subsidiary, right, to those overarching values. Power is its own purpose within the Russian system, as it is, of course, in a lot of other political systems. But as a result, anybody making a decision within the Russian system, right, whether it's somebody running a troll farm outside of St. Petersburg or somebody, smuggling nerve agents into Salisbury, right, has to have these priorities in mind. And the Kremlin itself will have them in mind when deciding where to seek conflict, where to pursue compromise, and how to invest in its courses of action. Right? So from the outside, right, this means that we need to evaluate anything that appears to be a Russian policy objective in the context of these questions about maximization of power and maneuverability. So if we're going to assume that Russia is looking to undermine Western democracy, which is the upshot of the Russia report, right, then we need to understand how and why that effort serves the overriding aims of maximizing power and maneuverability, and indeed whether it serves those aims. And a clear-eyed approach to that, I think, keeps those aims. A clear-eyed approach that keeps those aims in mind, right, should allow Western policymakers better to understand the cost-benefit analysis from the perspective of Russian counterparts. Right? So rather than assuming, as the report I think rather blithely does, that Russian power is both kind of aimless, right, and that it just wants to achieve troublemaking in order to undermine Western policymaking and Western democracy, but it's also unlimited, right, that it has seemingly unlimited resources at its disposal, right? I think both of those things are problematic assumptions. The second point is that Western policymakers should remember that Russian policy decisions are often experimental or improvisational. Right? We often ascribe a lot of foresight and analysis to the Russian system. I think more than seems to be borne out by the evidence. In reality, decision makers often don't know what's going to work ahead of time. Right? This is true, for example, both in the use of sort of ideological wedge issues to regain the initiative against the opposition after the Bolotnaya protests, or frankly, the use of ideological wedge issues recently in the constitutional plebiscite. It was true in the annexation of Crimea. This makes decision makers initially conservative, right? People in the system tend to stick to solutions that have borne themselves out, right? And it militates against, fixing what's not broken. Change policy courses unless they have to, right? And when they are forced to change tack, right? We tend to see a broadside approach, right? Firing multiple cannons at multiple targets to see where a dent can be made. Again, this is something very different than what we assume to be sort of the masterfully manipulative, highly targeted, highly analytical approach to policymaking and to conflict that we often ascribe to the Kremlin, right? So again, from the outside, this forces us to question the extent to which Russia really is wedded to long-term, globally encompassing courses of action, such as ending Western power. Seen from this perspective, I think a lot of positions that might appear to be ideologically driven, in fact, begin to look more like pragmatic responses to threats and to opportunities, in which commitment is underpinned not by sort of orthodoxy or dogma or ideology, right, but by calculated cost-benefit analysis, caution, and of course a degree of bureaucratic inertia. And lastly, I think we need to understand sort of the coalitional nature of Russian power, right? So conventional wisdom, again, and really the Russia report, frankly, holds that Putin runs a strict sort of command and control hierarchy or a vertical of power. I imagine this is something that Andrei might talk about, but the idea of co-construction that Graham and I developed really implies that people are doing Putin's bidding more for their own reasons than for his, right? And this view has multiple consequences. For one thing, it means that the coalitions of interest, right, that in some cases empower Putin, can in other circumstances hem him in, forcing him to contend with the interests of other important players in the system, including citizens to a degree, but certainly other interests within the elite, right? It also means that self-interested actors are generally guided by their own interpretations of what is in the interests of the system and of Putin himself, rather than by clearly communicated commands and orders. So Western policymakers need to be skeptical of assumptions that courses of action, including the presence of multiple Russian actors in British politics or American politics or anybody else's politics. But we need to be skeptical of assumptions that these courses of action are pursued on the orders of the Kremlin, or even always with the Kremlin's prior knowledge, right? If people are acting in a self-interested way, of course, with the idea that the Kremlin would approve, that's very different from saying that they are acting on orders. We have situationally motivated, sort of entrepreneurially experimental, self-interested, and basically autonomous actors, right, who are creating what we see as Putin's power, whether domestically or internationally, precisely because they act in what they understand to be Putin's interests without having to be told to do so. Right? The result is I think, a peculiar kind of durability, right? So a co-constructed system of power is likely to be impervious to outside attempts to encourage change by driving a wedge between the elite and the president. We've seen with the failure of sanctions really to achieve any kind of change of policy, right? Because elites are in any case acting in their own interests rather than simply Putin's interests, right? But by the same token, as these various actors come to see established courses of action as politically and economically profitable, it becomes harder for the Kremlin itself to shift approaches, right? So what I haven't done, of course, is to propose any sort of policy looking forward, but I am trying to argue for a different approach to analysis, including policy analysis, but academic analysis as well, right? One that can maybe, hopefully, reduce the number of costly policy mistakes that Western governments make, hopefully reduce the amount of unhelpful hyperbole and distortion in our public and policy debates as well. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Okay. I can talk now, right? Okay. When I was, first of all, thank you for having me from Moscow, taking part in this very interesting discussion. When I was reading this report, I was thinking about 2008 when Novaya Gazeta, and back when I worked for Novaya Gazeta, sent me to London to report on why the British were so bad at investigating Russian organized crime, Russian mafia. And I went to London and I made a point to talk to as many members of law enforcement and security services I could find, from SOCA, Serious Organized Crime Agency, which is now National Crime Agency, to MI5. And to be honest, all of them told me one thing, that there is no interest and enthusiasm to investigate Russian mafia. And there were only 2 cases, as far as I remember, about Russian money laundering, that the focus was on drugs. And it's very far from what Russian mafia actually doing in London. And the reason I was given by almost everybody was a lack of public pressure from the society and from the media, because back then the British media were harassed and intimidated into silence by several Russian oligarchs who sued them and London court, and made actually it's almost impossible to write about and to investigate Russian oligarchs. The only area which was still available for them was private life, sex, this kind of thing. That was it. And to be honest, to me, it means that probably the problem we are dealing now is not only about politics and spies, it's much broader. It's probably not only about Russia either. Look, this golden visa we've been reminded in this report was actually introduced not only for the Russians in 1994. Lots of people actually used this way to get to London. Not all of them from Russia, some of them from former Soviet republics. And it makes problem much broader than we are talking right now. And to me, it means that what we are dealing with right now is very tactical. And I think this tactical approach has its flaws. First of all, well, Putin is a great tactician, and to fight him tactically might be a big challenge. Second thing is when you accept the logic that this approach should be tactical, I can produce a number of say reasons why to do it very quietly, and for instance, not to ask questions about Russian money in London. I could easily imagine someone from MI5 or MI6, even better, arguing inside that, look, because Putin is closing the country and it's getting really difficult to, say, collect intelligence on the ground in Moscow or other Russian cities, Britain has a gift, because they have this asset, they have these Russians already in London, and they have some intelligence value. They could be approached. Probably they could give some intel on what's going on in London, in Moscow, and these people should be dealt with very carefully. The other problem is that, tactically speaking, it's very difficult to limit any kind of action on people who actually, to us, constitute Russian oligarchs. We have a number of oligarchs with their origins from other post-Soviet republics, which do have very close ties to the Kremlin, and how to deal with them. And I think it's really, really difficult to try to limit this awakening to what we are seeing now only to Russia. And even tactically, it's questionable. But I think the problem here is that the British authorities should develop some sort of strategy. And to me, maybe it might sound a bit naive, but we need to think about something like principles. And we need to understand that lots of people who came to London in the 1990s and the 2000s, they had this big, say, problem with values they inherited from the Soviet Union. And what is the biggest difference between us and, I mean, now post-Soviet countries and, say, the West, is these very principles we sometimes forgot about completely. One of these principles is media freedom. And probably one of the things which should be updated is what's going on with British laws and British courts in dealing with libel, and because it's such a big problem. And we know that lots of investigations came to nothing because, well, journalists in London and in Moscow feared that actually they would be sued in London court. That is a problem which is there, and it should be dealt with. Even tactically, if we look at what actually happened, for instance, in the US after 2016, even tactically, it might have some value. As we all know, after 2016, the US started implementing the policy of naming and shaming, meaning that right now we have on the FBI most wanted list people from the Russian intelligence services, the very first time in history. And that helped actually a lot of journalists based in Washington or New York or London or Moscow to investigate this kind of activities of the Russian intelligence services, Russian oligarchs, all these proxy from trolls factories to hackers. This actually worked to some extent. We know that lots of operations of Russian intelligence slowed down because of this naming and shaming policy. Many operations of Russian intelligence actually stopped in 2016. GRU, Russian military intelligence, was in complete disarray for maybe 2 years. And I think this is something we need to think more right now, and probably that could be at least part of a strategic approach, not a tactical approach. We can't hear.
Natasha, yeah.
Sorry, I thought I was being automatically unmuted by Danielle. Yeah, thank you, Andre. I think that really highlighted, I mean, an issue which perhaps people hadn't really thought about, the fact that actually we lump together everybody from the former Soviet Union as Russians. And I think, you know, maybe we need to distinguish between these different groups, while at the same time acknowledging there may be Russians in the UK who actually don't really have any links to Putin, but then there may be operatives from the former Soviet republics who do have links to Putin, which perhaps have gone under-investigated. So now we're going to pass over to Dr. Chatterjee Doody. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natasha. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of themes I think that have already come through in what Sam and Andre have said. Particularly, Sam mentioned the idea of reducing policy mistakes in future, and Andre, who's talking about, you know, why the UK was so bad at investigating organised crime. And I think for me, this is kind of one of the key issues underlying what this Russia report brings to light. Basically, is it was less substantively about Russia than it was in fact about the UK. So throughout the report, there was a very generalized critiques of Russia and its activities in various different areas, often phrased in quite simplistic ways, with the specific details for understandable reasons redacted, but phrased in ways that I think potentially are not that helpful in terms of dealing with the underlying issues in the future. So terms used such as Russia being fundamentally nihilistic, subscribing to a zero-sum view of politics, and having paranoia about NATO and the EU, for example. Whereas the specific critiques that were raised about the UK institutional responses to the Russia threat were much more specific. So this was really about, I think, the UK. So that kind of explains why there's been a lot of dispute about whether or not this is in fact a smoking gun. So those on the pro-Brexit side have really latched onto this line about it being a damp squib with no evidence of Russian interference. Those on a more pro-Remain side have called it a damning indictment of government inaction and government disinterest in the bigger picture. And this conflictual interpretation of what the report shows what it means is actually quite fundamental, I think, to how we go about dealing with the policy implications. So I'm just going to speak very briefly on some of the kind of specifics that were charged in terms of the UK institutional response, and how really that's been represented, the kind of PR around the report that we've seen coming certainly from the Russian side for a UK audience, and ways in which we might want to think about addressing that in order that future policy directions can proceed kind of unimpeded, I suppose. So as I said, the report itself was fairly critical about UK responses and attention to the issue of Russian interference in the UK. questions very overtly, such as did HMG take its eye off the ball? The identification of a plethora of strategic plans relating to Russia, which it was insinuated within the report indicate a general lack of strategic coherence or coordination, as well as a lack of coordination between the institutions that have responsibility for actually following through on that. One of my favorite, I guess, parts of the report was quite a harsh statement on this, which is time spent strategizing is only useful if done efficiently and without getting in the way of the work itself. So it's very clear that the committee really thought there was a problem here in the ways of dealing with instances of Russian interference that were listed throughout the report. And it was also kind of identified this sort of disappointment that in relation to a subject of such great public interest, the intelligence agencies had sort of taken up the prerogative of refusing to comment on things that were the subject of ongoing investigations, for example, rather than being more forthcoming with the things that might not necessarily need to be classified. So it was very much a picture of poor institutional coordination, a lack of leadership, I would say, at the top, and just generally a very messy picture with no kind of clear understanding of what to do, how to do it. Now, this is particularly important when we think about going forward, I think, because this unclear picture about what the report represents, this is very easy for the Russian side to really take up and run with. And we have seen this happening quite a lot in the immediate responses to the report and its publication. So prior to the report even being published, we got a lot of pre-mediation from Russia's international broadcasters, for example, almost anticipating what was going to happen and setting some kind of safety net around that. So representing it as something that was going to intended to discredit the Brexit process, for example. Now, obviously, the report itself is seen in a partisan light in the UK, so it's very easy for key Russian political figures and Russia's international broadcasters to then piggyback off that genuine split in opinion about what it represents and how significant it is. And this is exactly what we have seen happening. So as soon as the report was actually published, we got a huge number of rapid reaction responses from the Russian international broadcasters. This is a trend that even the report itself did identify, this kind of rapid reaction commentary, and basically discrediting the report itself as being Russophobic, which was very easy to do given the kind of language that had been used in a generalized way about Russia, the idea of a blame game, and then some more specific criticisms which were based around discrediting the particular commentators that had been quoted within the report. So we saw a lot of stories talking about Christopher Steele having been discredited in the US, for example, or Bill Browder having, forged a new life for himself after having been charged with tax evasion in Russia. So the very, I think, familiar ways of discrediting figures that you see often in Russian international broadcasting, these were kind of mobilized immediately straight afterwards. Now, why is this important? Well, the reason is because there's genuine disagreement in the UK about what this means, as I say, along partisan lines. And the problem is that once that kind of disagreement does already exist, it's very, very easy to then mobilize that for these political aims, whether by UK actors themselves, or I think more importantly here, by Russian actors who would prefer to imply that there isn't some sort of consensus, that there even needs to be a move forward as a result of this. So there's been a lot of, say, quoting of those figures who've said, this is an attempt to discredit Brexit, leading Conservative MPs, for example, as some sort of legitimate source for that allegation. And I think one of the really key, if I was going to stress one really key issue of importance when moving forward, this is that this cannot be framed in very general terms as a sort of Russia threat thing. It must be portrayed as something very specific and very strategic. And in the report itself, it was clear that, a clear strategic line has to be taken and clear accountability between the institutions who are going to investigate this needs to be established. And I think really that needs to be much, much clearer in how the report and its significance is represented to the public. And essentially, that responsibility lies mainly with the committee members themselves, because we know that there is a significant resistance at the government level to engaging with the report on that kind of basis. So for me, the key thing here is very much picking the specifics of how we need to approach this, of looking at those democratic processes, how we would investigate those, rather than framing a more general kind of Russia threat, which is so easy to dispel with these very frequently repeated conspiratorial narratives that essentially even those with an interest in paying attention get very bored of, and very quickly think is something that it's impossible to get to the bottom of. So we need it to be very clear. We're looking at specific things. It's not general, and we need a specific line forward on this. So I think I'm going to stop there.
Oh, hang on. Thank you very much, Precious, also for keeping to time. So now we're going to move on to Dr. Ruth Diamond from Department of War Studies at King's. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, Natasha. So I want to talk about some slightly more kind of general issues, I guess. But I want to pick up and entirely agree with Andrei's comment about the kind of tactical approach that this report appears to take, because I think that's part of the problem, a significant part of the problem. I think what the report displays, and it's typical not just of, unfortunately, British political culture, but I think US political culture as well. There is a lack of understanding about how we got here to the position that we are now. A misunderstanding in some important ways, I think, about divisions in worldview and differences between Russia and what the report repeatedly calls the West. I think there's also a significant problem in thinking of Russian interference more generally as a kind of partisan wedge issue in UK and US politics. And finally, I think one of the real problems that the report kind of speaks to is a failure to understand who it's talking about when it talks about the need to defend the West from Russian interference. Because I think, and I'll talk about this very briefly, I think one of the questions that we're failing to ask is what the West means in the contemporary context. And this obviously has implications for how we respond to Russian interference. The first of these points really, I think, is, and it speaks to an issue that the report raised itself actually, which is a lack of broad and deep knowledge inside US and UK political institutions and civil service, a lack of knowledge about Russia. And I think in this particular case, one of the problems that the report shows very clearly, I mean, it doesn't identify it, but it is itself an example of it, is a lack of understanding about how we got here and a lack of curiosity about how we got here, in fact. So the report repeatedly presents Russia as the Russian government, and it uses the Russian government and Russia interchangeably, which is a problematic issue in and of itself. But it repeatedly kind of presents the Russian government as a kind of straightforwardly hostile actor in relation to the West, and a hostility that has kind of come out of the personality of Vladimir Putin, and also to a lesser extent out of some kind of innate Russian political culture. And there's a profound, as I said, lack of curiosity about actually what has caused the hostile relationship in which we now find ourselves. So the report, on a number of occasions, says essentially that as soon as Putin came into office, bang, any attempt to have a positive relationship with Russia was done, and Russia instantly, in effect, begins to start behaving in a very hostile way towards the United Kingdom and towards the West. Now, I mean, this is not in any way to dispute the reality of the Skripal and Litvinenko poisonings, you know, various kind of activities against conducted by the Russian government against Western governments and Western society. But nevertheless, I think it is unhelpful and reflective of a longer term problem in US and UK thinking about Russia to simply assume that the relationship has deteriorated because of totally kind of unprovoked Russian hostility. And I think actually there needs to be a deeper engagement with an understanding of how we got here, as I say, and that means thinking about what happened to the relationship in the 1990s. It means thinking about the fact that we do not always, as the report seems to suggest, promote a rules-based international order, and that things like the invasion of Iraq clearly contributed to Russian governmental perceptions of you know, Western interventionism and high-handedness. But actually, in order to engage with what's happening and to engage with Russian activity, Russian involvement in Western society, Western political structures, we actually need to understand some of the reasons why this has happened. And they do not lie entirely, as the report suggests, in the personality of Putin. On a separate point, one of the things that struck me very much, actually, looking at the report, was the way that it, to a large degree, actually reflects back a lot of the worldview and thinking that you see in Russian analyses of the Russia-West relationship. In particular, you know, the idea that the Russian government is engaged in kind of zero-sum thinking in relation to the West actually seems to me to be quite descriptive of the way that this report thinks about relations with Russia. It itself seems to me to be quite zero-sum in its approach. And that's something, I think, a failure to properly interrogate the assumptions underlying Western approaches to Russia is a problem, a significant problem, I think, for our understanding of the relationship and also for thinking past the current impasse. Coming back to something that Precious mentioned a few minutes ago, but kind of building on it, I suppose, or kind of expanding on it, I absolutely think that that the view of Russian interference as a partisan issue in domestic politics, both in the US but also very prominently in the UK, is a major obstacle to actually addressing the reality of interference in Russia. By Russia. Now, when we have a situation in which one of the two parties, both in the US and the UK, has a kind of political investment in not acknowledging interference in specific electoral outcomes, then it's really not possible for that state to build a coordinated response. And, you know, for as long as people are dug into the idea that the Brexit referendum result was absolutely the fault of Russian interference or absolutely nothing to do with it, and that the US presidential election outcome was absolutely the result of Russian interference or absolutely nothing to do with it, as long as those positions are really entrenched in political partisanship, then it's going to be very difficult for legislatures and governments to actually, and indeed society more generally, to build a consensus response. And this is going to be the case, I think, I mean, it's going to be the case beyond this, but it's going to be a specifically acute problem until the outcome of the US presidential election. I think it's very hard to see any movement on any of these issues really until November. And then, you know, I think whatever the outcome of the US presidential election, we will start potentially to see change in how the US and the UK address questions of Russian interference. You know, clearly, if Biden wins, I think there's going to be a much more assertive approach on this question. If Trump wins again, perhaps not. But so in a sense, I think, you know, the report highlights lots of things, tactical things that can be done, you know, legislative, technical issues to address. But the broader global political context, which on which all of this, I think, depends, is actually having a kind of coordinated engagement with the United States, and that's not going to be possible for the next few months. The final thing I wanted to talk about very quickly was I think one of the other real problems involved in addressing what the report identifies as a threat from Russia is the question of who it is that we think we're protecting. So the report talks about Russian interference being aimed at discrediting the West, and I think that's a kind of it's the kind of language that you hear a lot from policymakers in the UK and the US and the media, but actually, you know, that's predicated on the assumption that we all know what the West is at this point, and I'm not sure that that's something that we can really say with any degree of confidence. One of the big problems confronting the British government, the American government, governments elsewhere in Europe, is the kind of slow collapse of, or the pressure put on key Western institutions, and with it the idea of what the West actually means. So, you know, if the West is NATO, then what does Turkey's contemporary relationship with Russia say about a unified, coherent West? What does Brexit say about it, for that matter? Where you have a kind of rising nationalist, anti-cooperative impulse from states or from particular governments, where you have splits over kind of ideological issues or over values issues, including things like women's rights, LGBT rights, you know, the divide that's opened up between some governments inside the European Union and other governments inside the European Union. And, you know, when you have indeed the President of the United States taking an approach to NATO that's rather more consistent with NATO being a protection racket than actually an institution that reflects shared values and shared goals, then it's very difficult to talk about the West. And so I suppose my kind of final point would be, if all of this is aimed at, you know, if the report is aimed at getting us, or the UK government, to think about protecting the West, that surely the first order of business has to be to think about what we understand by the West, because we can't protect something that we don't understand, or about which, you know, we can't really speak with any degree of confidence. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your insights there. And I mean, there are so many great points that all of the panelists have raised. But I think you make the very important point that, you know, we shouldn't really assume any kind of unity in the West. You know, what does the West actually mean? And clearly that could also, and probably is, something that, you know, can be very useful to Russia in its disinformation efforts. And I think that also reinforces the point that, you know, quite often Russia doesn't necessarily, if we go back to what Sam said about Russia not having a strategy, I mean, we may agree with that, but if we were to agree that Russia doesn't necessarily have a strategy, then we can say that, you know, perhaps it is also enough for us, you know, in the West, just to fail to essentially deal with a lot of our own problems. You know, so to some extent, you know, perhaps Russia doesn't really need to have a very focused strategy. You know, it can kind of sit back and watch us tear ourselves apart. You know, that is one kind of school of thinking, of course. But I wanted to open it up to Q&A. We don't seem to have many questions so far. We do have one question which I could put to all of the panelists, perhaps. But I think in a way, perhaps Ruth touched on this. The question here from Tom Pitcher: does NATO have a bigger role to play in developing the strategic response? And are we expecting too much for individual state actors to operate on anything more than the tactical level? So going back to the panelists, perhaps in order. Is Sam there? I'm not sure.
I seem to have lost Sam.
Sam has
He had a
disappeared.
bit of internet problems, but he's trying to get back on as soon as possible.
Okay, well, how about if we just maybe get a few responses from those of you who are on the panel at the moment, Andre, Precious, and Ruth. What do you think about this question raised by a member of the audience, which is, that it's too much to expect individual states to respond?
Well, let me start because I'm the biggest outsider to this problem living in Moscow. I think it's actually a big challenge to think of response in terms of the role of NATO, because part of the problem is not only, say, conventional warfare or conventional espionage, but we are talking increasingly about information warfare. And one of the biggest problems here is what we are militarizing this information space unnecessarily. And it sort of reflects how the Kremlin perceives the information space. I think it started back in 2000 when Putin signed the first information security doctrine, when he decided to treat information as a weapon and people who disseminate information as information warriors. And as a journalist, I'm not really comfortable with being described as an information warrior or a soldier. And I think it's a big problem now that the West seems to think that essentially military structures could have a say at information policy towards Russia and at how to respond to spreading of disinformation. Because military, by definition, they think that we need to respond by describing everything in terms of threats, by thinking of the information space as a battlefield. And I think it has a lot of flaws, because the moment you start treating information as a weapon, you started playing the game the Kremlin has been for the last 20 years. And then you have RT treated like BBC, and foreign journalists like trolls, and Russian journalists as traitors, and it could go on and on and on. And I do not think that military organizations should have a real say in this issue.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting, given what we know about NATO's strategy vis-a-vis Russia. Thank you, Andre. Precious and Ruth, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'll come in. I think so. The subjects that the Russia report deals with are many and varied. Disinformation and influence is one of them. There are various others too. Now, I absolutely agree with Andre that on a topic such as disinformation and that kind of informational influence, it does not make sense to unnecessarily militarize responses to it, as would be the case with NATO. And as it happens, NATO has been paying increasing attention in recent years to this kind of disinformation or influence threat. And I think not to maximum effect, if I could put it that way. I think NATO's capacity for dealing with these kind of issues really isn't that well developed. There have been some issues, I think, with the initiatives put in place. That's not to say that there's no place for NATO in dealing with some of the other issues, and certainly I do think kind of state-to-state cooperation on certainly the kind of intelligence side of threats is quite important. So I wouldn't discount that, but I think it's very much got to be driven by the specifics in each of those cases. And not, I think this is part of the issue with that I was taking with this representation of Russia as this fundamentally nihilistic zero-sum actor, without the level of attention and care that's paid in this report, even say to the UK side. It isn't just one unitary actor with one specific key strategy in all areas. that can be treated in the same way. And I think that's really part of the big recurring problem that we have, is there's an attempt to kind of boil Russia down to the bare bones and what's the answer to the Russia question, essentially. And I think that, you know, we must at all costs really avoid doing that. So I think that that's one of the issues you get when you think about, well, shall we just, you know, palm this off to NATO? Well, which bit and what, essentially. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Precious. Ruth?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. But I also do think that, you know, in a sense, that if we want, or if rather, if the UK government or the UK Parliament wants to think about this as an issue of Russia versus the West, then you do need some kind of coordinated response, right? I mean, we can't all sit here in our little, you know, on our little islands thinking about these kinds of issues independently of each other. But obviously, it would require NATO to work as a more coherent actor than I think perhaps it's in a position to do at the moment. Again, this may change after November this year, let's see. But there will remain kind of significant problems, I think, of NATO coherence beyond that. I also think, you know, and this is not something that you would expect to see in a parliamentary UK report, given the shape of the current government, but I also think, you know, there would be a role for the European Union here as well, a different kind of, you know, non-military role. But you know, a lot of the kind of issues that the report raises, you know, including questions of, you know, dealing with organised crime, but also to do with, yeah, you know, kind of interference of various kinds, the role of the media, all of these kinds of questions, and indeed the status of democracy, which is something that comes up again and again in the report. You know, all of these are also issues for the European Union. So I think if there's going to be any kind of coordinated response, it also needs to take that into account. But again, that's not something that the current UK government would be in a position to engage in, let alone agree with.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. And actually I mean, of course, the EU does have a so-called disinformation strategy and a special unit dedicated to it. But from what I understand, it's been kind of stumbling along somewhat and has really had, at least to my knowledge, not many resources devoted to it. And just reading something that Mark Galeotti wrote, and you know, just throwing that out there, where he suggested a response should not be predicated on either NATO or EU, but should be what he calls a coalition of the willing, you know, perhaps something along the lines of, you know, the Five Eyes, so US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but you know, that's maybe something to discuss later. Welcome back, Sam. We were just answering a question about NATO, but there were a very large, well, quite a few more questions. So I think perhaps we could move on and actually, you know, the next question I think speaks to something that you really highlighted in your talk at the beginning. So somebody asked, if Russia did have a strategy, wouldn't it be part of its strategy to pretend that it doesn't? So perhaps we could start with you, Sam. Nice, easy question.
Certainly, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that look, Russia is not traditionally strong in a lot of the ways that we think of countries being strong in international politics, right? It doesn't have. I mean, it has more force protection capability and things than we used to think it did, right? But it really thrives through the manufacture and manipulation of uncertainty, right? One of the ways that it manages to, and I should clarify that by Russia, I do, of course, mean the Kremlin. One of the ways that the Kremlin manages to get what it wants, both internationally and domestically, is by keeping people guessing about what its strategies are, right? If you are constantly trying to second guess your own analysis, right, then you're not settling on a course of action that might itself become limiting or become a limiting factor in Russia's own calculations, right? And there have been exceptions to that, right? There have been times when various coalitions, right, whether the EU or for a time a coalition between the EU and the US, were able to settle on strategies around sanctions, or frankly, even the response to Salisbury, right, that did become, very real, not in ways that fundamentally changed Russian policymaking, but did become very real for the Kremlin. But that hasn't been most of it. I mean, I think we can go back to the House of Lords report, the last time there was a big parliamentary report on Russia in 2015 after Crimea, right? The report was saying essentially the same thing that this one is, right? That we have failures of analysis, we don't really understand, and so now, 5 years down the road, we're still in the same place, right? So, but I think partly, right, that's because for some of the reasons, right, that Ruth has outlined, right, we haven't taken a hard look at how we got there in a way that understands that there are multiple parties to this. I think going back to the conversation you were just having about the role of NATO and whether there's a role for the EU there, I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding of the geopolitical nature of the European Union. That's a lack of understanding that's shared whether in London and Brussels and Berlin or in Washington. But I think the fact is that the militarized aspect of the conflict, particularly in and around Ukraine, right, really was predicated on conflict with the European Union, not on conflict with NATO. And so the idea that we could resolve that somehow from a NATO perspective rather than EU perspective, to me, is again a failure of analysis, right? But if we look at the actual sort of trace out the processes that got us here, go back to a time when the cost-benefit analysis from the Russian perspective looked different, when it was difficult for Moscow to countenance sanctions that would have locked it out of European financial markets in important ways, that would have really raised the cost of capital for Russia. If we begin to understand how those calculations began to change, both for domestic reasons and because of changing interpretations of international constrictions from Moscow's perspective, then we can maybe get back to some kind of a realistic, materially based, right, approach to Russia.
Thank you, Sam. Does anyone else want to come in on that question? If Russia did have a strategy, wouldn't it be part of its strategy to pretend that it doesn't? If not, then we can go on to another question. Okay. Well, there was another interlinked question, which was, how can Western actors deal with the West if Russia has no strategy? I don't know if anyone wants to. I think we've probably maybe partly answered that already.
Well, I might just.
I mean, the only thing that I would say, sorry, go on. Yep.
I might come in on that briefly, which is to say that most of the strategies that we have seen vis-a-vis Russia, right, whether it's been from a NATO perspective or from an EU perspective, or frankly from a national government perspective, have been more focused on trying to understand what Russia wants, right, rather than trying to understand what we want, right? So if you look at all the iterations of EU strategies, towards Russia, whether it's partnership for modernization and the four common spaces, or what have you, right, or even the sanctions strategy, it's all been about trying to change or modulate what Russia wants. There's been very little conversation about, well, what kind of relationship do we want to have with Russia, right? Are we happy to see Russia as a country that is governed in a fundamentally different way, right? With whom we, agree to disagree on just about everything that matters, right? To put Russia sort of in a China or a Saudi Arabia category in which we have purely transactional relationships, right? But we build significant barriers to integration, right? Or do we in fact think that there's too much shared space, right? There's too much space in which there's competition in terms of the Eastern neighborhood, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, which we're seeing right now. And it's simply too close, right? Geographically, economically, and otherwise, in which case we do need to, in fact, invest in a relationship that has integration of some kind as its end goal, right? But we keep sort of allowing ourselves to be drawn away from that conversation, right? From a conversation about what are our own interests vis-a-vis the relationship with Russia, right? Into a conversation endlessly about trying to understand what Russia's interests are. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I think that comes back to a point that Ruth made in some ways. I think the idea that with China it's somewhat different because, you know, China has never been a supplicant, if you like, in the way that Russia has. You know, if we look back to the 1990s and the whole idea that, you know, we were going to kind of almost rebuild Russia in our own image and so on, you know, and all the assistance programs. But, you know, the idea that, you know, there was going to be some kind of linear transition to democracy and so on. So there's this kind of, you know, interrelationship with Russia, if you like, you know, disappointments and what have you that we don't have in the same way with China, I would suggest. And I think that's maybe what Ruth was also talking about in terms of the past and the present, perhaps.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Sam, not for the first time. Incidentally, just apologies to the person who commented about me not looking everyone in the eye. It's because I'm reading notes, so I'm writing as people are talking. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the problems with this report and generally with US and UK governmental responses, you know, is that it assumes that that the status quo is where we are and there's no changing it, right? That, you know, that Russia has all by itself manifested as this authoritarian state. I mean, some of the more kind of more extreme kind of popular representations, you know, effectively represent Russia as some kind of political version of the, you know, Bond villain's hollowed out volcano with Putin sitting in the middle controlling everything. No, the lack of curiosity about how we've got where we've got, the lack of interest in engaging with Russia as a political actor that's capable of change, right? Is, I mean, it's one of the more depressing aspects of this report, I think, but it is absolutely typical of the way that US and UK political elites tend to talk. And I think, you know, in terms of Sam's absolutely correct question, you know, that we need to think, or our governments need to think about what they want from the relationship with Russia. I do think that depends on the prior question of thinking about who we are, who the we is in that, because that's going to determine what we want. As it is, you know, taking Russia as this kind of fixed, hostile entity, as I said in my earlier comments, it's very much actually like the way that Russia seems to approach ideas about, you know, the West as this necessarily hostile, more or less unified entity that's with whom you have to engage in certain limited ways, but with whom you have a zero-sum relationship, and with whom actually the possibilities of cooperation are pretty minimal. And I think we need to think beyond that. And I think it's a responsibility of governments to think beyond that. Otherwise, we're going to be in exactly the same position that we are now in 20 years' time. Right?
Thank you, Ruth. Precious and Andre, do you have any comments on this?
I've got not a massive amount to add really, but I would just say, kind of following on from what Ruth said, it's not, I think sometimes in this big strategic picture, we get bogged down in what the kind of normative vision of that would look like. And the fact of the matter is that there have been so many countless examples of cooperation between, say, the EU and Russia, or individual states within the EU with Russia on specific kind of targeted initiatives and objectives. And when there is that kind of specific delimitation with very clear common goals or desires, then that does work very well. And I don't think we should then be kind of shy about admitting that. I think sometimes then in this lack of an overall normative vision, it kind of takes away from that. Well, yes, there is a role for pragmatism as well, I think, but that also demands taking into account that when certain rules and expectations of the international order are broken, those do need to be dealt with, obviously. I think sometimes exceptionalizing Russia is the key problem here, that, you know, we don't necessarily need to think just about it as a sort of Russia threat, but look at those specifics. You know, what collaboration can go ahead, how do we react to specific instances, and how can we build a the kind of institutional structures and capacities for actually doing that, because I think capacity is really one of the key issues that keeps coming up, and this is why the same kind of debates and issues occur time and time again in every kind of iterative report cycle or whatever. We see the same things because we haven't got that long-term strategy building in hand, really, I would say.
Yeah.
If I may, I just wanted to add one thing. It looks like we are talking about the West and Russia in terms of state actors, and we have this image of Russia as something which is about the country with no population, but with the Kremlin, maybe the army, trolls, and spies. But I think it's a big misunderstanding here, because we have not only, say, civil society and activists and journalists, but we have general population. And sometimes we seem to overlook some natural advantages Britain has in Russia. Well, actually, Moscow society for more than 10 years was obsessed with London in the early 2000s until maybe 2012, because lots of people wanted to go to London. It was very fashionable, and not only journalists, but fashion industry and culture figures all modeled themselves after Britain. And it was such a big thing, movie industries, books, everything, even the most popular Western media in Moscow until recently was The Guardian, because people and ordinary people wanted to see what is going on in Britain. And I think there are so many opportunities here. For instance, some years ago, somebody told me that there was an idea to translate some stuff in The Guardian in Russian, and not only articles about Russia, because this stuff is translated by Russian agencies, but something about ordinary lives British live. And it's such a big asset, I think. It's such a big advantage you have. And in this case, sometimes for instance, I look at the questions you have, and a lot of questions about that we need to have a coordinated response. And to be honest, I'm just thinking, do you need this kind of coordination? But it's a very Russian approach to have this hierarchical order and have one guy on the top and to direct everybody and to fall in line. And actually, it's not even the case for the Kremlin. What we learned recently, that they can use proxies, they can use some semi-independent actors to great effect, and it was really successful. But they learned that from the West. So why to lose this ability to have so many independent structures to the idea of we need this better cooperation? I just don't see any point in that. Look, during the Second World War, the British intelligence in Far East never coordinated the actions actually with London, because there was no point to send all this intel staff to London to take a decision about what's to do in Singapore. And I think it's such a great advantage the British way of decision making has. So why to lose it?
Thank you, Andrei. I think you made a couple of really important points there. And actually the point you make about, well, I don't know if we want to call it British or English soft power. Mark Galeotti has just written about Anglophilia in Russia, and suggesting that this strong trend, which has lasted for many centuries, and he cites the example of Ivan the Terrible asking for the hand in marriage of Elizabeth I, which of course didn't come to pass. I mean, it would have been interesting if it had, of course, but I think you're right. There is that very strong interest in the UK and its culture and traditions and so on. And I mean, I don't know whether that can, or how that can be harnessed, but I think also perhaps those people who assume that all Russians are somehow hostile, I think, to us and to the West. I think that probably underestimates that. And on the point of coordination, actually there was a question in the chat saying that the report identifies a very hard problem to solve in dealing with Russia, because on the one hand, you need to deal with all of these different agencies, you need to work on multiple fronts. But on the other hand, that means you have a kind of dispersion responsibility, which will make action much harder. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I would. I'm picking up on something you were just saying a moment ago. I mean, I think it's worth noting that so Russia is opening up for international travel or air travel again in 2 days' time, right? With 3 destinations: Turkey, Zanzibar for reasons that nobody understands,
Coffee.
and London, right? And so, either that says that London is just on par with Zanzibar, or it says that there are certain limitations, right, on the Kremlin's ability or willingness, right, to cut off and maintain isolated or broken communications and links with the United Kingdom. And so, it's again, if we're going to think about policymaking, we need to think about not only our own cost-benefit analysis, but the other side's cost-benefit analysis as well, right? And it's something to bear in mind. One of the things, though, on that answer to the question about, do we spread ourselves too thin, is that hopefully this is also an opportunity to say, look, some of these problems, right, some of these fronts, right, are not fronts on which we actually need to place resources, or we need to place resources in a way that is more about thinking about our own governance and institutions rather than about, some kind of strategic or even tactical action and counteraction in a way that we think of fronts, right? These are not battle fronts, right? These are areas, some of these are, right? Some of these are areas where we need to think about, okay, how do we make sure that, Russian intelligence agents don't show up on British soil with nerve agents, right? But some of it, right, is about, well, how do we make sure that electoral processes are safeguarded? How do we make sure that we actually enforce laws on foreign money in elections? How do we make sure that we actually enforce, and use properly unexplained wealth orders, right? How do we make sure that we actually have beneficial ownership registries, right, for limited companies, right, that we have promised but haven't actually delivered, right? How do we make sure that in a post-Brexit era we have transparency? These are not about Russia. These are not questions about Russia. These are questions about the quality of governance in the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union, in all of these other places, right? If we continually make them about Russia, right, then we will not solve them, right? Because we will be playing whack-a-mole every time we see somebody with a Russian accent or a Russian name or a Russian limited company shows up, right? Rather than actually thinking about what is it that makes institutions function properly. So if we can, separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit, right, then maybe we can, actually let the intelligence agencies focus on intelligence, right? And let the rest of us focus on governance.
Can I just add to that or make a comment about that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I mean, again, and as normal, I absolutely agree with Sam. But I think to this question of trying to tackle this complex issue, dealing with multiple fronts, multiple agencies. Well, I mean, before I was an academic, I was a civil servant, right? And one of the things that Whitehall is very used to doing is coordinating, right, across agencies, across departments. So in terms of the British response, where there is political will and political competence, that isn't necessarily a problem. I mean, it takes time to set up these kind of coordinating structures, but it can be done where people want it to be done. I think the more fundamental problem, and hopefully it's one that governments in the UK and the US and elsewhere are now addressing, and if not, hopefully they will soon, is that this lack of coordination, this lack of kind of broader thinking about the challenges posed by the Russian government, but not just by Russia, to our democratic practices and to the question of kind of legality in the UK, the rule of law. One of the problems has been, I think, a profound complacency in our government and in society generally about the inviolability of British democracy, and the fact that Britain is not a corrupt country. It's not a country whose democracy can be corrupted. It's not a country where kind of money from dubious kind of overseas sources, or indeed dubious domestic sources, you know, can have a chilling effect on media freedom, on legal processes, on the rule of law in various ways, and of course on our democracy. So there's been a lot of complacency, and I think you see that complacency in the report, a failure to recognise that actually, you know, Britain doesn't have this kind of cast iron guaranteed democracy. It's something that needs to be worked at, and you know, it's no more or less solid than the democracies of other countries. But that idea that Britain is and always will be a kind of a democracy that no other country can kind of interfere with is part of the reason why we are where we are, I think.
Thank you, Ruth. Actually, one of the questions. Sorry, Precious. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, can I come in on that as well, please? Because I think this it's really important, really, to focus on this kind of broader governance issue, that there are certain issues to do with governance that are relevant and important regardless of Russia's role in anything. And I think actually that's one of the ways in really focusing down on that governance issue is one of the ways that we can potentially combat some of the kind of partisanship issues, because obviously any actor, whether a global, you know, a state actor or sub-state actors like fringe political movements, for instance, any actor can exploit weak governance structures. Any actor can exploit weak democratic safeguards. And in the, you know, we're talking about the UK case, and for us in the UK as a society, these are important issues regardless of whether that's got anything to do with Russia at all. And I think that's the key reason why we should have serious discussions, serious debates about how we make sure that these governance procedures, these democratic safeguards are operating as they should be. And really that's the kind of focus that we should be taking on this. And I think I just maybe pin onto this, there was a question in the Q&A as well about Labour asking Ofcom whether it should be rethinking RT's licence. And I think this is part of the same thing. Now, the question is, do we think that in general Ofcom does a good job of regulating the British media sphere? And if so, it should be left to do that. If not, then the whole structures need to be looked at. But this should not be something on a case-by-case basis that demands political involvement, because that sets such a massively dangerous precedent. And I would personally say, in my experience, Ofcom does tend to do a really pretty good job of regulating the British media space. And that's not to say that infringements don't occur, but Ofcom does tend to pick them up and does tend to pick them up reliably. And, you know, the example of this is the big investigation into RT that took place in 2018 over the reporting of the Skripal poisoning, and some of the reports about Syria as well. It was an extensive investigation. RT was found to be in breach, was massively fined. Not all of the programmes that were under investigation were found to be in breach. One was had that judgment rescinded, I suppose, for very clear reasons. You know, Ofcom has its procedures. It needs to be allowed to follow them very transparently without any question of political interference. Otherwise, I think this is simply going to create more problems, basically. So it's more about ensuring that we have these sensible procedures in place and then allowing them to run, making sure that all of the resources put into sustaining the kind of procedures that we need, but then kind of trusting in our own democratic system, I suppose, and making sure it's strong enough to deal with those threats, because they can come from anywhere if those systems aren't strong enough to deal with them.
Thank you. So your answer to the question, should the government look again at RT's licenses, is a no, essentially?
I think it's Ofcom's decision to make, basically. That's what I think, and I think it should be left to make that decision, really. And it's fine, obviously you can make a public appeal should you be looking at this, but personally I think that's a strategically dangerous thing to do from the Labour Party side, from any politician's side really, when Ofcom tends to be pretty on the ball when it comes to pursuing its investigations. The one thing I would say is that it would be useful to have a slightly clearer, slightly more transparency about when those kind of investigations are announced and as they're reported as being in progress. But other than that, I think the system works pretty reliably well, in my opinion.
Can I just say one thing basically, because this goes back to one of my initial points about the extent to which responses to this report and the content of this report and the wider issues of Russian interference are affected by political partisanship in the UK and the US. And I think it seems to me that one of the reasons why the Labour Party, under its current leadership, would be inclined to make this point would be as a way of distancing itself from the previous Labour leadership, which had a very different approach to RT. Indeed, I think the former Labour leader appeared on RT at various points. So again, we can see that and I mean, this is always going to be a feature, right, of any kind of significant political issue in a highly contested democracy, that it's going to become a partisan issue. But I think it's particularly notable in this case. And you can see here that this, I think, is not just a partisan issue in UK politics between the Conservatives and Labour, but actually it's a partisan issue inside one of the major political parties. It's a means of establishing distance from the previous Labour leadership, and that's that kind of bleeding across of domestic partisan issues into debates around media freedom, media regulation, and approaches to Russia. I really don't think that's helpful at all.
Thank you, Ruth. There was a question in the Q&A on the elephant in the room, i.e. Brexit, saying that, the report doesn't really ring any alarm bells on the Brexit process. The vulnerabilities exposed in the report for the Brexit process going forward. Do any of you have any comments on that? Andre, I don't know if you, of course, as you said, you're an outsider, but obviously the whole thing about, Brexit and potential interference, I don't know how it looks from your end.
To be honest, it's really difficult for me to say anything here, because I never investigated this story by myself, so I'm just a matter of it.
Okay, Sam?
Ken, on the Brexit front, look, my take on this, right, is that regardless of anything that may or may not have happened around the referendum, right, as with the election in 2016 in the US, their social science simply, or forensic science, does not have the tools to verify, right, the impact of anybody's online campaigning, right, on the outcome of an election or a referendum. So that's simply not a fruitful conversation. If we want to think about Brexit going forward, well, this comes back to something that Precious was saying, right? One of the things that makes institutions vulnerable, right, is the growing sense among people that institutions of governance do not deliver welfare, right? So if we continue to have socioeconomic decline and dysfunction, right, then we will continue to move in the direction of identitarian politics, right, which then makes everything more manipulable by everybody, right, whether it's Prigozhin or Aaron Banks or the two of them together, right? And so if you want to worry about how do we keep, malicious actors from, manipulating the outcome of Brexit, well, come up with a Brexit that works for people. I don't know what that looks like, but focus on welfare, right? Focus on reconnecting a material relationship between British citizens and their government, right? That makes the material aspect of politics more relevant. Again, and it doesn't simply leave us in the thrall of identitarian appeals.
Thank you, Sam.
Can I just say, just quickly, obviously the one of the points that was made widely about the report was that, of course, you're not going to find any evidence for anything if you don't look, right? And clearly there was I think both in the UK government's response, but also in the report itself, I think there was a careful not looking at this question, really. But it's not just about Brexit or indeed the Scottish referendum, which was one of the other election issues that was raised in the report. And I think it goes back to something I was saying before, which is that, if we focus on the specific case of Brexit, or the specific case of the Scottish referendum, or the specific case of the US presidential election in 2016, that's a way perhaps of not looking at the broader issue of democratic vulnerability and the wider problems in our democratic process. It's also a way of not, I think, for people who are very determined to say, the Brexit outcome was all about the Russians, right? Or the 2016 election was all about the Russians. It's a way of not looking at the very wide-ranging and serious societal issues that caused people to vote in the way that they did. So it's not looking at why it was that people were sufficiently discontented with what they attributed to the European Union to vote to leave it, right? So although I think it's an important question to raise, I agree entirely with Sam that it's not something that social science can answer definitively either way. But it's also, I think, in some ways, a side issue. I mean, a significant one, but nevertheless a side issue, because it doesn't go to the really fundamental problems, both of complacency about our democracy in broader terms, but also about the societal problems that cause people to vote in ways that are unexpected and for many of the analytical and political elite unwelcome.
Yeah,
Yes.
I couldn't agree more really with that. And I also think, actually, if we're talking about the elephant in the room, I would say Brexit in and of itself is not in fact the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is trust. And this is like such a long standing decline in trust in, well, political institutions very generally, also in the media. You can see this as underlying pretty much every element of what we're talking about here. So, it's not just about whether or not people believe that result of the referendum was valid. It's that they don't really trust any judgment about whether or not it was valid. So people will see those kind of nefarious actors, whether they're Russians or whether they are dodgy businessmen or whatever. They will see that behind it if they're not keen on the result. Or on the other hand, they'll see these ardent pro-Remainers as attempting to muddy the discourse. Again, it's a symptom of this bigger issue, which is the trust issue. And I think if we come back to the report itself, and we've all talked about the importance of this governance issue, aside from the Russia issue, and I think that is then intimately connected to the trust issue. So being able to say, okay, regardless of the partisan beliefs about the outcome of the referendum, but we all have these common interests in ensuring that the governance processes themselves are safe, are secure, are working as they should be. I genuinely think that from both sides of the partisan divide on this, that could work some way to re-establishing trust. If this process was done very clearly, very transparently, then I think that would really, really help. Actually, that could be a very important way forward, not just in this instance, but in generally to start pushing back against some of those longer term trends, such as the decline in trust.
Thank you, Precious. Yeah, I mean, so I think probably we have to try, and it's not always easy, but to separate out these two things, our strategy towards Russia and our Brexit process, but I think people do like to conflate the two for particular reasons. Andre, do you have any final thoughts? Because I don't know if they're about to pull the plug, but I think we have officially come to the end of our time. So Andre.
Just one thing, probably I would end with something I started with, that probably what Britain needs is to talk not about Russia per se, but about principles and values. Putin loves to talk about values and traditional values and all that, but actually that is where the West is, it's having a higher end, and because it should not be about one particular country. Tomorrow it might be some other central, say, Asian country which decided to hand down their dissidents on the British soil. So for that, you would need to develop something else. And that's why I think it should be something about much more general and much more important and strategic. It should be about principles of transparency, principles of media freedom, and that some people should be held accountable. And in this case, you can easily defend this strategy even in Russia, because in this case, it would not be directed against one particular country.
Yeah.
Remember that for the Kremlin, it looks really good when you get attacked, because it makes Russia be seen inside as a besieged fortress, but also it helps to feel more self-important, that you have all the West fighting one particular country. It makes two of them equal in a way. So it should not be about one particular country. It should be something about what is going on in Britain. And in this case, it should be about your principles, about your values. I think it would be much more beneficial.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And, I think even in the report, it says Russia wants to be a great power. And obviously, there's no better thing than saying, we are these kind of equal interlocutors, and, we acknowledge you as this great and powerful threat. And the idea that, the Kremlin is this kind of omnipotent octopus-like power, So I think we have to maybe rethink the way that we do talk about Russia to some extent. Sam, do you want to come in with a final word?
No, I mean, I think that Andrei summed it up really well. So I just thank everybody again for the opportunity to take part in this, and to the audience for sticking with us for an hour and a half.
Yeah, thank you very much to the audience and for your questions. I think we covered almost all of them. There may have been one near the end, which was, does the UK have a faulty strategy towards Russia, or was it a good strategy that was not properly implemented? Well, we've kind of, I think, talked about whether there was or wasn't a strategy, and I think we've probably concluded that there was a faulty strategy. I mean, I'm not sure whether you can say that it was a good strategy that wasn't properly implemented. I don't know if anyone has any very final thoughts on that question. Otherwise, we'll have to go away and think about it, and then maybe we'll have another webinar later in the year on that. Thank you to everybody, and especially as we are already really in the middle of the summer. So, I think we probably by now all deserve some kind of break. Break, time to go away and think even more about Russia. So thank you again to everybody, and thank you very much to the Department of War Studies and the King's Russia Institute, and to the technical support. Thank you, everybody. Have a great summer.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.